thank you for staying tuned. I'm really excited to be a part of this. I work with the Forest Stewards Guild, and this series is in collaboration with the Forest Stewards Guild and Glorieta Freedom Ranch, and part of a larger New Mexico Department of Agriculture program called the Soil Health Program. And so this is really happy to share this with you all. And I guess without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Jan Willem Janssens. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. Am I audible?
Yes, I hear you crystal clear.
Very good. Welcome, everybody. This is the third and last webinar in this series of exploring soil health in pinyon juniper woodlands. And we're talking today about management practices in woodlands to improve soil health. The webinars in general introduce the critical importance of soil in holding water, and it's the natural growing medium for plants and many other forms of life. And they explain the self-generating and self-healing capacity of the soil, especially in cases when the soil is not overly stressed. We're addressing soil as a living ecosystem that we need to take care of with attention and dedication in order to allow it to come to its fullest potential of harvesting and storing water, supporting plants and other life, and providing the many services that soil basically provides for us in the living environment that we often take for granted. So I'm a landscape planner and forest ecologist of background. Studied landscape architecture in the Netherlands and got a degree in agricultural sciences as an overarching degree from that college. I've been here for 23 years and have been working on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch for the last 10 years at least, I think, and have been doing forest restoration work for most of the time that I was here in the United States. Soil health has always been an interesting point of attention for me because I have been looking always at the interactions between woodlands and forests and watersheds, and that leads then to soil and water conservation issues. So it's very exciting for me to share from my insights and experience with you as we go through this last third installment of soil health in pinyon juniper woodlands. So today we're continuing to explore and explain, which is really the purpose of these webinars. And after defining what soil health really is in the first webinar and how you can measure that in the second webinar, we're looking today at how woodlands should be managed, particularly for soil health. And we're addressing what forest and woodland management practices you might employ for general ecosystem health and how they address soil health in those pinyon woodland, juniper woodlands. So I'll start again with a brief overview, a summary overview of our study area, the Glorieta Freedom Ranch, and explain in more depth the different types of pinyon juniper ecologies, because that's really important to understand in relation to management practices, because each management practice is different for each type of pinyon juniper ecology. Then we'll take a look at the pinyon juniper woodlands and our soils on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch and how they relate to the management needs and management goals there. We'll address again briefly the Healthy Soil program's 5 healthy soil principles in relation to management goals, and then have a brief break for question and answers. And the main focus today is on the management measures for soil health and ecosystem health. So we're going to address that in the second part based on our findings from the Bullseye method, which I will briefly revisit because I went over that pretty quickly in a previous webinar. And that will indicate pretty much what management practices are necessary for different locations. And you can also see how different woodland types or ecosystems have different problems and require different management practices. I will also mention some cautionary notes regarding the management practices based on what we have learned and based on the literature in relation to management practices and soil health. A lot is still to be discovered, and there's a lot of research going on, but it's interesting to share what we have already learned about what works and what doesn't work. And then we end with another question and answer session. So briefly here again, the Glorieta Freedom Ranch is on top of Glorieta Mesa, pretty much at the highest northern point, and also in the southwestern corner of the Pecos National Monument, or the Pecos Grant. Glorieta Freedom Ranch is about 900 acres, consists of several parcels, as you can see on a map to the right. And we're looking today at specific case study areas, you could say, in a woodland site and a grassland site, but management practices basically from all over that ranch in relation to the soil types that I'll show as well on a soil map. The ranch is owned by Brad and Kathy Holian here in this picture, and the ranch operates as a tree farm. In the past 15 years, the ranch has been managed for conservation purposes and underwent a series of ecological restoration and stewardship activities, and many of which I will share today with pictures and explanations. So to just give you a brief overview, and especially for those who have not participated in either one or both of the last two webinars, the ranch consists of persistent woodland, in the picture top left, some ponderosa pine stands, bottom left, alluvial fans with grass and forbs. There are wetland and riparian areas, and valley bottom grasslands. There are some other intermediary types that we'll address as well. So, but at least you can see there is a diversity of woodland ecologies and soils, and that makes this ranch so interesting as a case study area for this webinar series. So I'm coming back to the discussion of the different pinyon juniper ecologies, because as I said, management recommendations and practices are very different for each of those different types. And let's look at those different ecologies a little bit more in depth. So in 2008 and 9, a research group around William Rami identified 3 key pinyon juniper ecologies: the persistent pinyon juniper woodland, the pinyon juniper shrubland, and the pinyon juniper savanna. And that distinction is still widely used by a lot of researchers to identify the differences. However, in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot more subtlety, and I will address that too. But to understand really the big differences, I've outlined them here, and they are really related to tree and grass proportion, elevation and precipitation, soil type, fire regime, and biodiversity. So for the persistent pinyon juniper woodland, it is a woodland type with a high dominance of trees and a much lower grass cover percentage. This woodland type is largely at elevations above 7,000 feet and in locations where there is a dominant winter precipitation. The soil type is pretty coarse, from rocky and stony, gravelly to maybe sandy. There might be patches of loamy soil, but in general, the type is much coarser than other types of woodlands. Very remarkable is that the fire regime, based on research and tree ring data, has proven to be very long in terms of its intervals, 400 years and more, with intervals sometimes up to 800 years. And the biodiversity needs to be studied more, but it's probably pretty high because of a diversity in this kind of old growth type of woodland, where openings are created through die of the trees, and where young plants and brush grows back into in those openings. The pinyon juniper shrubland is more a mix of trees and grass and shrubs, of course. It's also above 7,000 feet generally, and predominantly, well, has a combination of winter precipitation and some summer precipitation. But many of those places have an important winter precipitation component. The soil type is actually quite variable, from gravelly and sandy to loamy, all across the board, basically. We are not really sure about their fire regime, and it's speculated that the fire regime is not very frequent, but not as long, with long intervals like in the persistent woodlands. And the biodiversity is high because it has a very great diversity of structure and plant species. The savannas are obviously grass dominated with a scattering of trees. They can be far less scattered like than in this picture, with much more grassy openings. Typically, they occur below 7,000 feet and are dominated by summer precipitation. They grow typically on finer soils, here and there sandy, but loamy, and sometimes even clayey. The fire regimes are debated. People think that the fire regimes might be relatively fast. There are some indications here in New Mexico that those fire regimes might be every 25 years, more or less. But we're not sure. More research is needed. And the biodiversity varies a lot and might be somewhere in the middle as to what you can find. It's not particularly high, not particularly low. So the stars indicate which of those types can be found on Glorieta Freedom Ranch. That's the persistent woodland and the pinyon juniper savanna. So 3 other types have been identified specifically for New Mexico in addition to the ROMI classification. And they are identified by the team of the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute with publications online on their website. And they've published the pinyon juniper restoration framework, which is really useful to look at to understand in more depth what's going on with pinyon juniper woodlands in New Mexico. And so they identify basically 6 different ecologies, although sometimes the juniper savanna is lumped in with the pinyon juniper savanna. So here again, we have that an open woodland type that has still a lot of trees, but also now a grass component, because the grass grows in these openings, in these intercanopy openings between the trees. The elevation is typically below 7,500 feet, and it has a combination of winter and summer precipitation. The soil type is still generally coarse, from rocky to sandy, sometimes loamy. Fire regimes in those open pinyon juniper woodlands are somewhat unclear. They need to be studied more, but they might be varying from maybe 100 years to 400 years or something. They're a sparser, more harsh ecology than the persistent woodlands, but because of the grass component, there may be actually, and maybe because of drought, a more frequent fire regime. The biodiversity also here needs to be studied more, but because of the openings, I suggest or presume that actually we have a greater variation in structure and in plant types across this landscape, which may actually give here and there some pretty high biodiversity ratings. Going to the juniper savanna, of which we have a lot in New Mexico, pretty much everything east of Las Vegas and south to Roswell, east of the Rio Grande and even to the west of the Rio Grande into the San Agustin plains is all juniper savanna. Because it's savanna, you have a lot of grass, but also, of course, the tree component. It's clearly at much lower elevation, typically below 6,000 feet, but all the way down to 4,000 feet. And with a predominant summer precipitation in these landscapes, the winter precipitation is rather low and definitely not as much snow dominated. Soil types range the gamut from gravelly, even rocky, to all the way loamy. Fire regimes are somewhat unknown, but they might be relatively high again, like in the other savanna, pinyon juniper savanna case, because of the grass component. And it depends largely on whether these savannas are grazed. If they're grazed, of course, the grass is not as tall, there's not as much dry material, so fire risks are then much lower, or fire incidents at least. Biodiversity, again, ranges a lot depending on the situation, and can be from moderately high to moderately low, but certainly needs more research. And then there is a grassland with pinyon juniper that is also throughout central and southern New Mexico a lot, and on certain parts here south of Santa Fe, like in the Galisteo Basin, Row Mesa area. A lot of that is grassland with pinyon juniper, and in which we have seen also encroachment of pinyon juniper. And I'm going to talk more about this entire encroachment idea a little later. Clearly, there's a lot of grass in these landscapes, largely summer precipitation, and they're also lower than 6,000 feet typically. They grow typically on fine, loamy, and sometimes clayey soils. The fire regimes can be pretty short because of the grass fire potential, and biodiversity ranges because of other ecological variability issues in the landscape. Now, the type that we have on Glorieta Freedom Ranch is the open pinyon juniper type. So then the other pinyon juniper ecologies that have been either described or that I have identified are that of ponderosa over pinyon juniper forest. And that mix really exists all around Santa Fe in different locations. And it's very interesting because there are old trees from both the ponderosa species and the pinyon juniper species. That might be partly as a result of fire suppression, but might be also because it's its own ecological system. And more research is needed to really figure that out. It has a pretty high tree proportion. There's generally little grass in this landscape. The elevations are around 7,000 feet or a little higher, and it has a mix of winter and summer precipitation. It's typically growing on coarse soil types, from sandy all the way to rocky. Fire regimes we don't know about, as I said, requires a lot more research, and the same for the biodiversity. Then, as a subset of pinyon juniper shrubland, I identify riparian pinyon juniper shrubland. We don't have a lot of it, but where we have it, it's really important in terms of biodiversity. Again, here we have a tree and grass component. We have winter and summer precipitation, and the elevations for riparian shrubland go up pretty high, to 8,000 feet and below. Soil types range the gamut from sometimes even rocky and platy structures all the way down to the fine sedimentary material. Fire regimes we don't know much about, and as I said, the biodiversity is typically high. Then, which is really mentioned in a lot of papers, is what is called impacted pinyon juniper woodland. We don't often know even what it was, but we can look at the soil type to maybe get a sense of what it might have been. Nowadays, they have typically, because of openings, a grass regeneration component and remnant trees. You find this typically below 7,500 feet because of proximity to roads and settlements. And you find winter and summer precipitation here. for some reason, I found that they are on coarser soils and all the way down to maybe loamy soils, but not very, very fine soils. Maybe because those are too muddy in certain times of the year to even work. We don't know about fire regimes, and because of the regeneration that's happening and combination of grasses, shrubs, and trees, the biodiversity might actually be very high in some places. And that has to do with regeneration of this type of landscape. I mentioned this, of course, it's not an ecological, or well, it is an ecology in itself, but it's not often studied as such, but it's important in relation to management practices. Now, we have all three on Glorieta Freedom Ranch, and we will come back to those in relation to management practices. So, in relation then to sum it all up, in relation to these PJ ecologies, you can ask yourself some questions, and these questions are also posed in the literature. How can we increase biodiversity and resilience of pinyon juniper ecosystems? We don't know much about it yet, but some questions are coming forward, definitely also in relation to soil. Other questions are that we wonder whether for a given ecological site, we can figure out whether trees are encroaching or not. For instance, in these pictures, do we know whether actually the trees have been encroaching in a savanna or in a grassland here? We don't know, and some clues are in the soil type, but it's somewhat unclear. More research will be necessary to figure out this entire aspect of encroachment. That the same is true for open and persistent woodlands, where there are now openings, and we wonder whether maybe in some cases they are overgrown savannas. The question is then also how much grass is to be expected in those landscapes. Clearly, when the soil texture is more coarse, like gravelly and rocky, the grass component is probably much lower than what's to be expected on loamy and clayey soils. However, we've also seen that on south-facing rocky soils like here, just east of Santa Fe, the grass component actually can be very high, so remarkably high. So that actually, we might think that those areas were probably more open woodlands with a significant grass component. And then you might ask what the fire frequency might have been. Well, the fire frequency has been upset a lot by grazing over the last 200-300 years. So we don't know in some areas what the fire frequency was. Also, pinyons particularly, and sometimes juniper, burn up entirely in fires, so that there are very few fire scars available to study, unlike, for instance, in ponderosa pine forests, where we have a lot of fire scar data from remaining trees. And then the question is, will soil moisture and soil health decline or increase after stem removal? That is currently a subject of intense research at UNM and various other locations, where they're looking at cutting trees and what openings, the remaining openings do to soil health and whether it goes up and down. And various sources have various different answers. Various literature sources have different answers to this question, and it's probably highly site-specific and soil-specific, climate-specific, based on the variability that I've shown in the previous pictures. So what we do know is that there's still a lot of work to be done, that an area's history and past land use and management are critical in understanding the current conditions. We also understand now that soil conditions and soil health, and especially root-associated microbiota, and especially the fungi, determine a lot about the pinyon juniper ecosystem and tree health aspects above ground. We also understand now that sufficient tree density and ground cover are essential factors for soil health and eco-hydrologic resilience, which means the total resiliency of the ecosystem in relation to runoff and soil, water infiltration, etc. That we also have seen that carbon accumulation occurs in plants, litter, soil organic matter, and microbes, which is really important to understand, and that the diversity of plants in these pinyon juniper ecosystems might actually boost the carbon accumulation, maybe even to a point that carbon sequestration in pinyon juniper woodlands might be actually very important proportionally in the arid West, proportional to other ecosystems. So mineral carbon sequestration results from plant growth and soil microbial activity, and disturbance of pinyon juniper ecosystems, we've learned, has often led to long-term loss of soil health, water infiltration, biological resiliency, etc. So let's look at that now on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch. We have here predominantly woodlands on a drainage that you can see here within the study area, within the blue box that I studied through the web soil survey. Within that is the red line of the different parcels of the ranch and the orange lines of the different soil types that crisscross the ranch. And the property, you could almost think about it as a bowl. You can see almost a hand shape or claw shape of the drainages that go down. And the main drainage is the Power Springs coming here from the north, going down all the way down diagonally across the property. And the drainage is typically in soil type 702, and I'm going to explain later what that means, but it's a grassland and drainage soil with very fine texture. And then a coarser texture is in the side arroyos, which is soil type 703. You'll find that here. And then there are slopes and ridges that typically have soil type 707 on the lower slopes and 708 on the foot slopes and plateaus. You see that here all over. It's an alternation between 707 and 708. In some places you have still 702 with open grasslands like here. And on north-facing slopes, we have 717 or 705 all the way here in the southern part of the property. So that looks like this, that the valley bottoms with very fine sandy loam grow grasses, forbs, and Rocky Mountain juniper, like in the picture to the left. The arroyos with alluvial fans and rocky and fine sandy loam grow ponderosa pines, Rocky Mountain junipers, piñons, and grasses and forbs, like in the top right. And sometimes they're much more open even than in that picture. And then very small soil type is 705 with mesa slopes, and they're on mesa slopes and shoulders with a loam and clay loam soil, sometimes with caliche below it. That's the petrocalcic soil, which inhibits infiltration to some extent. And it grows piñon, one-seed juniper, and oak. The other soil types, the most important soil types in terms of the woodlands, are again the 707 and 708 in this picture. They have more sandy loam in the 707 lower slopes with piñon, juniper, oak, and grass, and vary from very open to dense. And in the 708, we have loam and clay loam soils on the foot slopes, and cobbly loam and fine sand on the plateau shoulders. Here and there, even rocky material. The foot slopes grow piñon, juniper, oak, and some grass, and the plateau shoulders that are more rocky or cobbly have ponderosa pine, piñon, juniper, and grass. So now let's look how the land has changed over time. That's an interesting one. I compared several Google Earth images for two parcels here for us between 1991 and 2017, basically 3 sets of images among many different kinds of a time series of Google Earth, but they actually show quite nicely how the landscape changed. So here's 1991 for the northeastern lot. Then we see in 2011, 20 years later, that this has changed, although it's a little hard to see between black and white and color. But you see that the forest, particularly the ponderosa forest, increased in density. Pinyon juniper maybe a little bit, but grass cover decreased, maybe as a result of drought. And we had some development of roads and some structures. And then in 2017, we also can now see that in certain areas we've had thinning, especially this area here, where you can see the gray in the bottom area, which is the slash, and also in that area. And now the northwestern lot, 1991, and then 2011, we see suddenly that there was a lot of tree removal here in the northern part, and a lot of little forest roads or skid trails that probably to get to those trees. And then in 2017, that has partly grown back in. Some of those roads are still there, but we see a new thinning area along this main forest access road. So to sum it up, what are the changes? Well, on the northwestern lot that we just saw, wood cutting in the north central valley, many small forest roads and tracks, infill in the remaining pinyon juniper and ponderosa, and maybe a reduction of grass cover, maybe caused by drought. Then between 2011 and 17, we saw partial infill of pinyon juniper in the north and south valley, that V-shaped valley where we saw initially a lot of wood removal, but then a new thinning project in the pinyon juniper on the west side along the road, and an increase in slash cover. On the northeastern lot, we saw the development of roads and a home in the first 20 years, the infill in pinyon juniper and especially ponderosa, and reduction of grass, maybe again as a result of drought. In the last 6 years, the thinning of pinyon juniper in the center and some ponderosa thinning in the east, the increase of slash cover, the gray color underneath the trees, and more connected forest openings, greater structural diversity, and a forest edge length that is increased. That actually led to improved biodiversity in this forest. So as a transition to management practices, because knowing now what happened in the past, we can talk about what has been done and what we might do in the future. We can also link that then to the 5 soil health principles. And those are, again, keeping the soil covered. And we've learned already that that's very important for erosion control and for soil biological diversity, microclimate improvement, and that again helps biodiversity in general. Minimal soil disturbance and external inputs. So very important not to compact the soil, not to just spray herbicides. There are all kinds of other ways that we can deal with problems when they come up in these landscapes. Maximizing biodiversity, creating openings, ecotones throughout the diverse forest mosaic. It's very important to have diverse stories of vegetation and a plant diversity, because that leads directly to a diversity of microbiota underground and a cycling of organic matter into the soil that leads to the rapid breakdown and the development of stable organic matter that is so critical for soil development, as we've seen in previous webinars. Because that then also leads to the development and maintenance of living roots in this type of a landscape, and as in any other growing and cultivated landscape. and natural landscape, of course. And that integrating animals into land management helps with all of the other previous soil health principles and creates greater biodiversity and helps, in fact, with minimizing the soil disturbance that you otherwise would have if you would use equipment to accomplish some of these other principles. In 2010, I was part of a small group that worked on a management plan for the Glorieta Freedom Ranch. And we worked with Brad and Kathy Holian to identify the management goals. So I made a summary of the goals here because there is a longer list of goals and specific objectives. But particularly for this webinar, I picked these ones out because they're the most critical ones for us to look at. The first goal was to preserve the land from ex-urban development and restore the ecological health and biological productivity of the land. And as subsets or objectives of that goal was to return to natural ecological dynamics and restore biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and riparian and wetland ecosystems. That's kind of a combination of multiple objectives stated in the forest stewardship plan, but I lumped them together here in this bullet. Also because you can see then directly how those objectives of those days directly relate to the contemporary soil health principles, the healthy soil principles too. Number 2 of, now I forget it, what was it again? Minimizing soil disturbance and external inputs, creating biodiversity, a living root, and introducing animals is very important in relation to all of those objectives mentioned here. So then managing drainage and minimizing soil loss, of course, is related to those of having cover and optimizing biodiversity. Improving grass cover, forage production, and grazing relates to almost all of them as well, from improving cover to improving a living root and introducing animals. Improving forest health and reduce wildfire pertains particularly, of course, to the biodiversity principle, but touches on all of them. Other main goals were developing the property for low impact recreational uses, mostly trails and horseback riding opportunities, making the land and its management a demonstration model, for instance, for collaborative educational research and stewardship opportunities. Well, through these webinars, we're basically doing that. And fourth goal is to establish a management regime based on the philosophy of ongoing maintenance and ecological beneficial use, which might include some small diameter wood utilization, for instance, for firewood. And to boil it all down, it comes down to basically that we're managing for fire regimes, moisture regimes, grass cover and health, and biodiversity, like these images explain. So that leads me pretty well on time here now to an opportunity for some questions. So with this introduction, let me know if you have any questions about the background that leads now to a conversation about the management practices.
So if anyone has been having questions throughout the webinar to this point, now is a great time to submit them into the chat box. I don't have any at this moment, Jan Willem, but also if you need to step away from the computer for a second, this is a good time to do it. We're just going to take a brief 5-minute time here to answer questions that have come up. So yeah, let's see what we got in the chat. Okay.
So I want to clarify while the questions come in, that looking at this picture here, this is one of those areas in the northwestern lot where before Brad and Kathy Holian purchased the property, a lot of wood cutting had been going on. And so we're currently nursing that land back to health, you could say, because some rogue woodcutters had really entered this place and cut really a lot of wood out of it.
Mm-hmm.
The surprising features that we see right now is actually a very high diversity of grass cover, which we didn't expect on this kind of rocky and sandy soil. But there is a high diversity of grass. In some places I find more than a dozen different grass species, like the location of this picture. But you also see there is some dead wood, there's a lot of dead and down material, a lot of regeneration. There's even a ponderosa pine overstory, like you can see. So it's extremely diverse. And so although there was some unmanaged cutting, the result of regeneration and biodiversity is surprisingly high.
Nice. Paul has suggested that maybe you could speak about the results of the introduction of horses in the context of SHP 5.
Oh, well, Brad and Kathy have 2 horses, but they are very well kept close to the house and only grazing in different locations here and there, and their impact on the nearly 1,000-acre ranch is very, very low. In other locations, the impact of horses on rangeland, grasslands, pinyon juniper lands is of a completely different nature, because we have locations in New Mexico where on BLM land or other public lands, we have basically either reserves or areas where horses, often feral horses, have been released by the hundreds or over 1,000. And in some locations, that has led to ecological problems. So that is a conversation that is very touchy because of different values associated with either horse preservation or land preservation, and the short-term and the long-term impacts on either the horses or the land. And it is important to talk about very site-specific impacts and site-specific aspects of that. But yeah, from my perspective as an ecological planner, I have definitely serious questions about the wisdom of releasing large numbers of horses to those kind of areas. But it's a complicated topic that would lead us a little astray here.
Mm-hmm. And Brad added the comment that, until 2012, there were a dozen longhorn cows on the land from their neighbors to the south. So I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, so the landscape has had a grazing impact, pretty low impact, but all over the place. And the last 8 years of rest have definitely helped also see what rest would do to this landscape. So let's actually maybe go on at this point.
Okay.
And I would suggest that people save their questions to the end then. So I want to address the bullseye here again, where we're looking at this area very close to where the picture was of the break. And this is one of the monitoring sites of about 3 dozen monitoring sites that we have across the ranch. So looking at the situation here, the bullseye method asks us to look at understory and, for instance, the presence of topsoil. Understory cover is in the gold, meaning very good, if the amount of understory cover nearly to totally matches that what is expected or desired for the site. Or if it's lower than what is expected or desired for the site, and then it's in the silver category, or if it's much lower than expected or desired, and then it's the bronze category. So what do people think? you might want to just jot down your answers and we can talk about it later, or you can send them in the chat, and then Gabe will give them to me once we start to look at the bullseye target to compare it with what I found here. So the presence of topsoil or the lack of erosion is an important one indicator to look at too. If there's little to no evidence, then you're of course in the gold. If there are some signs of erosion or bare soil, then you're in the silver. And if there's a lot of it, then you're in the bronze. Well, we see actually a lot of brown, but actually most of that is not bare dirt. It's actually litter material on pine needles. So we're probably somewhat in the gold here because the situation is pretty good. Then we're looking at the amount of litter and duff, the amount of medium coarse fuels, and litter and fuel distribution. That has not so much to do with erosion, of course. It has more to do with fire risks. And there you look at how much litter and duff you have. Is it a lot? Then sometimes it might be good. It might also be not so good from the perspective of fire risk. It might be good in terms of ecological purposes that it has, in terms of breakdown of organic matter, habitat for certain species, and of course, soil cover. So it is important to talk in the group and with the landowner what the objectives are to really score this correctly, because it's a value issue, whether it is enough, too much, or not a desirable amount. The same holds true for medium to coarse fuels. In this case, we have an amount that's pretty normal for this kind of landscape, but whether it is desirable is another question, of course, in relation to how close by, for instance, important homes or other elements of value are that might be at risk of fire if a fire would erupt in this kind of landscape, which is not unlikely because of the grass and fine fuel distribution in these openings here. And that leads us then to litter and fuel distribution, whether it's uniform or not. Well, in this particular case, it's not very uniform because the rogue woodcutters left it left and right in various locations and piled up here and there, even under trees. So we have a problem here with litter distribution. Presence of soil life and soil moisture. Well, we definitely found soil life, a lot of different insects, lizards, horny toad that I found in this area. There's a lot of other life in the soil because I dug a little pit and it was really indicative to how alive the soil actually is. So that was definitely in the gold. Desirable plants is an issue whether you have desirable plants and the lack of weeds, for instance, above 66%, then you're in the gold, 33 to 66, then you're in the silver, or less than 33% desirable plants, then you're in the bronze. And whether the tree species richness and function is that what needs to be expected or not. So in a multi-storied landscape like here, where plants protect each other, help with each other with germination, have multiple functions for forage and all those kind of things, and soil cover, you have a pretty high tree species richness and high functionality of the vegetation. So we're probably in a site like this nicely in the gold. Age diversity and desired tree species, again, goes from gold being that what is expected or desired to a little less of that if it's in the silver, or quite limited, and then you're in the bronze. For tree health and vigor, we're looking at more than 75% of the trees on the site are vigorous and in good health, or 50 to 75% of the trees being vigorous and in good health, or fewer than 50% of the trees being vigorous and in good health. For the classification of gold, silver, and bronze. Ladder fuels and crown height. Fewer than 33% of the trees and clumps have minimal ladder fuels, then you're into gold. Between 33 and 66%, then you're into silver, and more than 66% having ladder fuels, meaning small trees that grow beneath the trees, or brush that is growing beneath the trees that actually catches fire and then leads to a crown fire or torching of the individual tree in case of a fire. That's what a ladder fuel means. And then we're looking at tree stem density, tree canopy cover, understory vigor and function, user and emergency access, and presence of living organisms. So the stem density here is a little lower than maybe expected, probably as a result of the rogue wood cutting in the past. Although if this is an open woodland, or maybe even a savanna, we don't know that quite yet, more research would need to be done, then it might actually be bordering to what's expected. Tree canopy cover. The canopies are still pretty small because of the cutting in the last, whatever, maybe 10 or 15 years. And so they're probably in the silver category. We'll find out when I see the scoring list. The understory vigor and function was actually pretty good. If it's more than 75% of the understory that is vigorous, then you're still in the gold. 50 to 75%, then you're in the silver, and less than 50% vigor of the plants being vigorous, then you're in the bronze. User and emergency access is if there is roads nearby or interior forest roads, and if the stand is accessible but on foot, then you're typically in the gold. If the stand is more difficult to access, then you're in silver, and if it's very isolated, then you're in poor, in the bronze area. Then the presence of living organisms. Therefore, you look, for instance, at whether you find pellets or dung from animals or tracks, what kind of non-plant life there generally is. And if there's an abundance of it, then you score it gold. If it's moderate, silver, and if you find hardly anything, then you're in the bronze. So let's now look how I scored that when I was there the last time, which was in June this year. So we found that the understory cover was pretty good, but not yet ideal. It was probably more than 66%, but there were clearly openings, as you could see, a little bit of bare ground and some patches of a lot of or decomposed or decomposing organic matter. The presence of topsoil was the same. There were some patches of bare dirt, and that's why I scored it in the low gold, but it was relatively good. Amount of litter, well, you've seen it. There was a lot of litter in this landscape. Also a lot of coarse fuel, but I put question marks in silver because it also means that there is a fire risk associated with that. Then the distribution of the litter and fuels wasn't so good, and I put in a low silver. We definitely need to do some work on redistributing those fuels. The presence of soil life and soil moisture was excellent. The desirability of the plants was high. Tree species richness was relatively good, and the age diversity was moderately good. As I explained, you may wonder whether actually the age diversity could be better, depending on what woodland ecology we actually should be dealing with here. Tree health and vigor was kind of borderline between gold and silver, because we had some trees with mistletoe, some trees that had compromised vigor and appeared to be stressed. There were definitely quite a bit of ladder fuels with a low crown height. So that goes together with the litter and fuel distribution, indicating that there is a forest fire problem here. And tree stem densities and canopy cover are unclear, as I mentioned. They look pretty good as they are, but if this actually was more of a persistent woodland or open woodland, then we might expect a little bit more, and then it would score a little lower. Understory vigor and function was relatively good, but could maybe be a little higher. Accessibility was excellent because there was a road a couple of 100 feet away, and the presence of living organisms was nice because we saw a lot of signs of wildlife. So that leads us then to make some observations of this monitoring exercise, in that we have irregular precipitation. This year and last year, there's also quite a bit of evaporative loss in this landscape. A moderate, well, the mineral cycle might actually be okay, but there's a lot of coarse organic matter, so it doesn't cycle as good, and maybe certain areas might be smothered, and definitely the woody material is poorly distributed. Community dynamics, there was a fairly rich wildlife and plant diversity, so that is pretty good. Although this area might benefit actually from some grazing. And the energy flow, well, it's moderate due to a missing vegetation layer or multiple layers that actually might be better for this site, and a lot of senescent, meaning dead plant material. So the possible solutions are redistributing the finer and coarser fuels, and maybe having some managed grazing for the disturbance of the organic matter, and stomping some more of that organic matter into the soil. So let's move on. I want to make the comparison with an observation here. You can also compare to the pictures here. The picture of last year was from actually November, a drier and more wintry situation. In June, of course, this year was a little better. But all the other indicators show also that we're doing a little better this year than last year. But season can definitely also change the perspective. So it's important to actually do these observations more or less in the same season. So that leads us then to conclude that we have fine and coarse fuels, that we have soil cover and erosion concerns, uneven litter and fuel distribution, and age class distribution needs to be improved, some ladder fuels, a low stem density, and a low canopy cover. And I'm going to skip the causes and solutions and go straight to the work needed, because some of this was discussed last year, and I addressed it basically implicitly when we talked about the bullseye. So the management measures here are that we might want to redistribute the fuels and plan maybe even for a prescribed fire. Have some work days to maybe move those fuels around. Then keep monitoring and maybe prepare this area for some grazing, although I haven't mentioned that here in the list. So if we look then also at the Grassland Bullseye, which is very similar and was the original bullseye method developed, in this one we also look at bare ground and the amount and size of bare areas and whether they're connected or not. So if there's little of it, then you're in the gold. If there is a fair amount of it, and if they're becoming connected, these open spaces of bare ground, then you're in the silver. And if there's a lot of it and it's all connected, then you're in the bronze. Well, what do you think? You're probably here towards the bronze, right? Erosion, the same. If there's very little or no evidence of wind and water erosion, you're in the gold. If there is some, you're in the silver. And if there's active signs of erosion, you're in the bronze, which is definitely the case here. Plant pedestalling, no to minimal plant pedestals present, then you're in the gold. Some pedestalling, then you're in the silver, and a lot of pedestalling, and then you're in the bronze. There's definitely pedestaling here and there, so this is probably between silver and bronze. Like in the woodland monitoring, we're looking at litter amount, distribution, incorporation, and also dung breakdown. It follows pretty much the same guidelines of indicators, from good being gold, medium being silver, and if it needs improvement, you're in the bronze. I'm not going to rehash this because that, I think, is pretty clear. We found actually a pretty poor litter amount, poor litter distribution and incorporation. So this area could definitely use some disturbance to bring that material into the soil. Then we're looking at the plants, their desirability of species, the age class distribution, and their functionality. Also here, we're identifying that we basically don't have undesirable plants. So there, at least we were probably in the gold. The age class distribution was not ideal, and the diversity and functionality was also not so ideal because we have patches of a lot of the same, not multiple species next to each other. And there's a lot of senescent, dying plant material. And then we're looking at living organisms, plant canopy, vigor, and plant distribution. There was a reasonable amount of living organisms. Plant canopy could be better, but it was not that bad where they at least grew. Plant vigor and color could be better. Here it was, there were a lot of dead stalks standing up, and plant distribution was patchy. So that was probably in the silver. So let's see how we scored it. And there you can see we have, like I mentioned, bare ground erosion and plant pedestaling definitely in the bronze because that wasn't quite so good here. Litter amounts were between silver and bronze. Definitely need work. Dung breakdown, we actually saw some of that. That was reasonable for the site. Desirable plants could be a little better. Age class needs to be better. Species diversity needs to be better. It was in the low silver in the scoring of late last year. And living organisms was reasonable, but could be better. And plant canopy vigor and distribution were also all in the low silver. So we need disturbance here. And fortunately, this area is going to be grazed, and that's exactly what is necessary here. And we need over time some cutting of juniper material and erosion control in those ruts. And that will actually help with the restoration of this place. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time because we need to really start talking about the management plan and the management measures. So this is an overview of the different soil types and the different management practices that are being practiced on the ranch. Thinning and lop and scatter of slash took place in these green circled areas. Mastication took place here in the southern meadow where there was encroachment of pinyon and juniper onto the meadow. We're talking about prescribed fire, and I'm not going to indicate where we might have that because that is a tricky situation in this landscape because there are also homes in the neighborhood. We've done some erosion control here in this big meadow, also here in an arroyo next to a road, and in several places in the drainage and above the drainage in this northeastern parcel. Then a lot of grassland restoration here in the southern parcel and various locations of riparian and wetland restoration throughout the property. And then there was some grazing a couple of years ago in this area. And there is a planned restorative grazing initiative being planned for this southern area that will be combined then again with this location. And in this area, there will be some fencing and water infrastructure installed. So that is the current plan. And let's look at the specific management practices that are associated with it. So first, I want to mention that again, the desired conditions are those of biodiversity with more pinyon juniper and ponderosa pine forest, some open pinyon juniper woodland with grass, restored riparian areas, and more grassy savanna. We also want more grass cover and erosion control, especially with more open woodland with grass and grassy savanna. And we're thinking about restoring the natural fire regimes and fire risk while also doing fire risk reduction near homes. So their treating of the ponderosa and pinyon juniper forest comes in, as well as the managed grazing to reduce the fine fuels in the grasslands. So the big question is, how can you restore these degraded woodlands, especially when they're degraded? The woodlands here are not very degraded, so that is not applicable so much to this ranch. There are many other places in the West where the erosion and the degradation are much more advanced and where there's a lot of weed proliferation. So it needs to be said that we're still learning and that there is really no silver bullet, definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that terrain conditions, pinyon juniper ecosystem types all play into this, and that in each of these different location sites and types of pinyon juniper, different solutions apply. And of course, it takes time. Often a combination of practices work best. What we do know is that limited human disturbance is in most cases really important, and that you should work when the soil is hard, work on top of slash or wood chips, because once you get compaction or ruts as a result of especially tire equipment, then you're actually adding to the degrading forces in the landscape. Managed grazing and resting from grazing are important tools to consider. Mastication has shown in the literature as a very important tool, often better than lop and scatter, combined with selective thinning. So mastication can also be done on piles of wood that have been thinned. We have learned also that maintaining clumps in the landscape when you're thinning is important, because these trees form little families, both above ground and below ground. And that leads then to more resilient trees and resilient soil landscape. Keeping the spaces between the clumps small is important. Managing wood, you need to manage the wood harvesting because, and this is not so important on this ranch, but in other locations with wood harvesting, bare dirt is being created by people driving into these areas. Compaction is then a result of those trips into the forest. You create tire tracks and slash piles, sometimes even under trees, that completely reverses the fire risk reduction that you initially had wanted with the thinning. Sometimes low intensity prescribed fires are part of the toolbox. Slash and litter distribution, as I mentioned earlier, and erosion control, weed management, and seeding are important. So from the last time, I think I mentioned that ecosystem conditions are really important in relation to the practices. The literature, Rami studies and others indicate that actually the practices in pinyon juniper should be limited to a few situations, like where there's degraded pinyon juniper ecosystems due to erosion, or degraded pinyon juniper ecosystems with noxious weeds, degraded grasslands due to pinyon juniper encroachment as a result, for instance, of many years of overgrazing or fire, and then rest that leads to pinyon and juniper encroachment on those fine textured soils where actually grasses would do better. Pinyon juniper and ponderosa pine forest, especially when fire is an issue, might be something to think about to reduce the pinyon juniper as ladder fuels in those ponderosa forests. And then pinyon junipers, ecosystems that are close to homes in the wildland-urban interface. Pinyon juniper ecosystems in utility corridors, of course, to reduce fire erupting as trees might touch the utility lines, or in relation to remote communication facilities, cell phone towers, and all other important infrastructure. And when pinyon juniper ecosystems are on ranches and where we need to create more grass for livestock production. So each of those have suggested treatments, mostly related to thinning, mastication, seeding, prescribed fire, and again, in many cases, keeping the soil covered. And then also keeping the soil covered for weed invasion prevention. So let's look at these different techniques. Mastication has come up, as I said, as a very important technique to use. However, there are some downsides, or cautions at least. They have to do with that if you do this at a large scale and create large openings with chips, that it can lead to drying or aridification of the land. And over time, to ecosystem conversion, that you basically don't get your either grassland or woodland back. And so it needs to be studied well as to what you want and what you can do and what the results would be of a mastication project. You need to prevent compaction or rutting and associated crusting and erosion of the topsoil, because that will lead to poor plant regeneration. Other cautions are that if you shred in drainage swales that big flows of water in these drainage swales, or even sometimes grasslands that can have several inches to a foot of water coming through after big rainstorms, can float a lot of the mastication chips away, pile them up at some point, and then you have a big bank of wood chips that don't cover the land and that have to be redistributed again. Also, if the shreds are packed too thickly, then germination will be pretty poor between and below the chips. There was a question asked last time about nitrogen balance. Well, the literature is split about this in that you can have nitrogen accumulation or decrease in the topsoil depending on the amount of material that you put down, the amount of wood chips, and that can then lead to weed invasion. Actually, breakdown over time may lead to nitrogen increases in the subsoil deeper down, 30 to 40 inches deep, where actually that leads then to plant food that can support long-term native grass regeneration. So it is a trial and error or a deep research and testing type of deal to figure out what the nitrogen balance is as a result of mastication or mulching in general in these woodlands. You can actually reduce weeds by having a good cover, and but it will take more time than for the native grasses to eventually come through. The benefits of this are to provide a protective cover to reduce equipment impacts, like I mentioned actually, and then eliminate soil loss and reduce evaporation. So that is definitely a benefit from mastication. And over time, you will definitely improve native grass cover. So This implies then that open questions for testing and research are how thick to spread it. Again, site specific, but also in general, we don't know that yet. And so a lot of trial and error and good observation is necessary. And my hunch is that in many cases, it's important to not spread it too thick. If it's thicker than 2 inches, then you're probably too thick for many sites here in the dry Southwest. And what to do to prevent weed proliferation is another issue that needs to be researched more, and that has to do with soil types, thickness of the shredding, canopy cover of the trees, whether you have done any additional seeding of native grasses, etc. Another important technique, of course, is thinning and lop and scatter. That's done much in the last, has been done much in the last 20 years. And evaluation studies now also indicate that we need to be careful with that, not thin too much, because that may lead to drying of the landscape again and ecosystem conversion. And it may lead to bare dirt and erosion in the tree interspaces. So careful selective thinning is important, especially where we have a fire risk. But if the openings are too big, then we get into trouble. And it's important to keep clumps together of the trees. The slash should not be piled too thickly, because then we get the same trouble with either weeds or a lack of regeneration, like I mentioned with the mastication. And on top of that, a lot of thick slash can increase the risk of ground fire that then can reach the lower branches of naturally low branching pinon and juniper trees that then leads to torching or ground fire. I mentioned too that in thinning and lop and scatter, you sometimes have wood harvesting impacts where tracks and lead to ruts and bare spots and slash piles that then also can increase fire risk. Sometimes there's also a reduced health and vigor of remaining trees that's been observed by practitioners, but also identified through research. And so it is important to, again, not thin too heavily and keep clumps together so that trees protect each other. That also will reduce the wind throw risk of exposed trees. In addition, it will reduce, to keep those trees closer together and maintain clumps, it will reduce increased mistletoe spread. And that by itself is a long story, but mistletoe has an optimal spreading if there are distances up to 20 feet between the trees, or even shorter by, like 6 feet, because then the spores jump just at their maximum length between the trees. And then by keeping the trees actually in a clump, the distribution of the spores is less. And then you can keep your openings between the clumps a little larger so that your risk of mistletoe spread is a little bit more decreased. And research of the last 5 years has definitely identified that thinning, or in general stem reduction in pinon juniper, greatly reduces bird species richness, especially of those that are obligate bird species for pinon juniper ecosystems. And then the nitrogen balance issue that I just discussed earlier. So the benefits are, of course, that the slash can help with erosion control, and that you may get some grass cover regeneration and improve root development and microbiome diversity in the openings and between, and even within the clumps of thinned pinon juniper woodlands. Questions are, what is the optimal clump size? We don't know that yet, and it varies again from space to space, again, or place to place. Observation, again, is very important. And it's the same with the maximum size of desired openings. What to do to prevent weed proliferation? You don't have that as much in thinned areas, I heard. It is more in mastication areas and in burned areas. But even here, preventing weed proliferation is an issue that needs to be addressed. Solutions need to be sought in seeding and very good cover of the soil to the point that over time, native grasses will dominate the weeds. And then the question is, when is lop and scatter better than mastication? And the judge is still out on this, and we should follow the research to figure out in what specific conditions we'll find that lop and scatter might be better. Prescribed fire, an important tool, although we need to be very careful because piñons are not as adapted to fire as pines. And so the fire intensity needs to be kept very low to make sure that fires don't escape in these piñon landscapes, especially because we often have a lot of fine fuels of grass and twigs and needles on the ground. And they definitely need to be moved away from the trees to prevent torching and crown fires or high burn intensities. A problem is also that if areas have burned, that there sometimes is cheatgrass, or if the areas have been disturbed before, and cheatgrass is very flammable, grows very concentrated, and may make a fire more intense. Then also after fires, cheatgrass may actually establish, which then makes follow-up fire even more problematic. Then there is a problem that fire can create connected bare spots that can lead to runoff and soil erosion, especially in a landscape that's dominated by heavy thunderstorm and associated runoff. We've mentioned that piñon juniper woodlands can be important carbon sinks, and if we burn too much, they will of course become carbon sources, emitting that carbon in the atmosphere, which is not desirable. So we need to be really careful with using prescribed fire in piñon juniper. And that, of course, if we use this also too much, then the large-scale mortality in piñons can lead to drying and ecosystem conversion. However, research has shown too that there are at least indications that fire may increase the mineral diversity in the soil and lead to improved regeneration of the site, especially with grass covers, but also with the microbiome underground. So there are remaining questions as listed here, again, with how we deal with weed proliferation, when to use fire in a most effective way, and how it interacts with lop and scatter and mastication, and what the resilience is of mycorrhizal fungi in a decade or so after the area was burned. Research on that is all ongoing, and we should await the findings so that we can improve the use of prescribed fire. Control, of course, we have done a lot of that on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch. There are still some data gaps in the literature about the evaluation of these practices. In the field, I can say that generally they work out very well, very effective, but they require maintenance. They also require very careful design and implementation to be effective and not to have to come back to certain locations to fix things. The erosion control, of course, requires that the causes of erosion, like heavy concentrated flows or grazing, overgrazing particularly, are removed. Otherwise, you're basically fixing a problem, but not fixing the cause of the erosion higher up in the landscape. The benefits are plentiful, from reducing soil loss to improving soil microbiota. helping organic matter and water to stay on site and to be retained, improve water availability, root development. But it is a very site-specific and high-cost investment, and that is often a trade-off that needs to be made as to the investment in these kind of these practices. So one thing that we're testing also here on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch is the effectiveness of hugels, which are mounds filled with woody material and compost for erosion control. And we're going to try a couple of those in the next coming years for gully stabilization. And that will be a test then to see how well they work for soil improvement and erosion control. Similarly, in riparian areas, a combination of drainage management, erosion control, deadwood clearing, ungulate control, so grazing of deer and cattle, for instance, and planting and reseeding can be combined for riparian restoration. Also, this requires careful planning and design, and it may not be effective if the degrading causes are not removed. The benefits are great because you get water to spread across the landscape, infiltrate, slow down, and really reinvigorate your forest soils. What is the most effective combination of practices and techniques, especially for severely degraded sites, remains to be a subject for testing and research. Again, on grasslands, a combination of techniques leads then to the approach of grassland restoration. Also here, careful planning and design is important to make all the pieces work well together, but the benefits are multifold. And like here on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch, we had great success with restoring this entire grassland back to health and providing continuous grass cover across a large area. Questions, of course, that come up here are, what's the role of prescribed fire? And again, whether lop and scatter is better than mastication. And what is the most cost-effective combination of practices? And again, especially in severely degraded locations. And then finally, managed grazing, which might be very useful in most cases, but it can be costly too. It requires a lot of monitoring, water infrastructure and fencing, and it requires also careful planning to be effective. Poorly managed grazing often causes damage to grasses and herbs, forbs, soils, and riparian areas, and leads to more trouble. So it is important to manage the grazing really well to be effective and beneficial. So how much and what kind of grazing and how much rest is really effective, and in what ways can it be ineffective, is an important question that needs to be evaluated based on monitoring in each different location. So that also means then, what is the site-specific effect of excluding grazing and the site-specific relation between grazing and fire risks? All those things need to be considered and studied on site, and it is important to watch the literature as to what comes out in terms of general lessons learned at other locations. That leads us then to some final lessons learned about pinon juniper, woodland, and soil health. Both the literature as my observations are that it is important to do as little as necessary, and that benign neglect is in general a pretty good approach. Especially in persistent woodlands, taking no or little action is important, because these woodlands are in fact old growth ecosystems. Unless you need to improve soil and grass conditions, if there's a lot of erosion, it's important to consider whether you should do something here. Focus on fire risk management in transition zones, especially in wildland-urban interface areas and susceptible ecological areas, is important to consider. But in most other locations, focusing on fire risk may not be so useful. Limiting thinning or mastication to pinon, juniper encroached grasslands and fine textured soils where grass can grow back is important. In many other cases, grass will not necessarily grow there, so thinning and mastication in those locations may not be so useful. So focusing those techniques in encroachment areas is particularly important. Mastication seems to be the preferred technique in the literature, and it worked out really well also on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch. Considering thinning and maybe prescribed fire in overgrown grasslands and savannas are useful to think about, and combining thinning and prescribed fire is generally better for soil health than only thinning or only prescribed fire. That's an interesting research finding. So that brings us now to the end of the webinar and a webinar series. And I went a little over, but if you have time to hang in there for questions, please do so.
Thank you. I've been watching the chat box here. I am holding on to see if anyone has questions at the end here. Please enter your questions in the chat box below if anyone would like to follow up on the section since the midway point. So I'll just see if anyone has any questions. Thanks, Paul. We're kind of hopping off here. Well, Jan Willem, I'm interested in the hugels that you mentioned. So personally, I mean, I guess I have a question about that. I've never really heard of this method before. These compost filled. Could you tell me a little bit about these structures and kind of the way that they function?
Okay, so yeah, so a hugel, or the full word is Hugelkultur, is a German word that comes out of the permaculture world, where where the technique consists of digging a little trench or a hole that you fill with woody material, pack it really well together, cover it, and fill all the voids and openings with compost, and cover it up with the dirt that you excavated. That then creates like a growing environment that absorbs a lot of moisture and gradually decomposes. And it has, if you build it well, optimal combination of air, organic matter, decomposing organic matter in the compost, already microbiota that are coming in with the compost, and of course water that is either being trapped as water flows down against it, or that falls in the form of rain or snow. And because it's also a hill, it will have a lee side where in the winter more snow accumulates, so that actually the entire area can remain relatively humid.
So is this something that goes
in an environment like here in the Southwest? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, it cut out for 1 second. I please continue.
Well, I wanted to say that here in a dry Southwest, you need to not put it in an open area where just immediately all the moisture evaporates. So you need to keep it in a place where moisture naturally will keep it wet, like in a little shallow arroyo, or near your home, where next to watering your vegetable garden, you can also water your hugel until it's well established and that you can plant things on it. And Kathy Holian showed me a picture, for instance, where she a plant, I forgot what it was, maybe Brad can remind me, and it grew at least twice, if not 4 times bigger there than on their porch in a normal soil.
Oh, interesting. Is
Brad
that
has something
I
there to
have a
show.
this is, let's see, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
This is, Kathy grew this, it's a winter squash in the hugel in our garden back behind the house. And this is a pretty impressive thing. We had one for dinner last night.
Nice.
Well, we have a few more to go.
Nice. So opportunities to plant in the hugels, and then they can be helpful for erosion control because they hold water well. Is that correct?
That's right. And so I've identified a couple locations on the Glorieta Freedom Ranch where I want to plant them or build them for erosion control. And I have another client somewhere else in New Mexico where I'm going to try the same thing this fall. So we're going to test it out and see how it works. And of course, these hugels need to have a little spillway. So I designed them now with a rock lining around them so that in terms of erosion control, water needs to be able to escape around them so that the sides don't erode as
okay.
water passes on along them.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Thank you.
And the trick is, of course, that behind the hugel in a little arroyo, the sediment will first accumulate. It will create almost within the first rainstorm a little mini lake of water, a little pond, in which the sediment will settle and organic matter. So that you also behind the hugel build, in fact, an entire little micro site that can grow grass and shrubs and trees over time.
Like kind of a little low area, or like a kind of slight depression there.
That is already there in the form of that gully or the arroyo that was there that will then gradually fill up.
I see. Okay. About how big do these end up being? I mean, I just saw the one that was on that slide, but like, I guess it probably depends on what you're building. But for the Freedom Ranch, what kind of scale are you talking about for this type of mound?
Oh, I think it was about 7 or 8 feet long. It was about 4 foot wide and about 3 feet high, 2 feet high maybe. And
Okay.
so that's kind of the scale of them. And that was still the test version in the garden. Once I start pioneering them in the gully, they will be maybe twice as big.
Okay. Thank you. I don't want to take up or monopolize the time too much. I appreciate it. Someone asked how you spell it. It's Hugel, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Nice. Brad added it in the chat. Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Nice. Well, I'm not seeing anything come through the chat, Jan Willem, so it seems like you've done a good job of answering questions as you go, which is good. And I don't know if we want to hang on a little bit in case other things come up.
Well, I want to mention that if people have questions, they can always contact me. My email address is at the bottom of this page, of this slide. And also, you will be sending, I think, to people a post-webinar link so that we can get your feedback, because we would like to have everybody's feedback to see what you learned and how this webinar came across and how the entire series was, because I'd like to report that to the state in their pilot project on education and outreach on soil health, because this is only the first year of their educational outreach sessions for the soil health program.
Yeah, thank you for that. we will be sending out like a Google form survey in the coming days, and I'll make sure pretty quickly hereafter to send out the recordings of the webinars that will be publicly available, so everyone can take a look at those to follow up if there was something you missed or wanted to check back on. Awesome.
Well, with that, I want to thank Kathy and Brad for working with me over the last 10 years and for offering the ranch as a demonstration site to this webinar series. Thank you very much, Brad and Kathy. And I've appreciated meeting everybody here in this series. And I hope that it's been helpful and beneficial to what you're up to in your professions or work or land.
Well, thank you. Definitely.
Kathy and I thank you, Jan Willem, for all you've done.
You're welcome. And thank you, Gabe, for moderating and helping with the technical end of these webinars.
Of course. Yeah, I've been really happy to do it. I've picked up a lot of useful information, so thank you.
All right, and I think we can sign off. And I have appreciated this opportunity to share with everybody on pinyon juniper woodland soils.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Signing off. Bye-bye.